If you think losing millions is painful, wait until you hear what happened the morning my own wife looked at our teenage son and decided he was worth less than a luxury sports car. That was the moment I realized money can buy almost anything except loyalty. She believed she had already won. She believed she had outsmarted an old man who had spent 40 years building an empire. What she never realized was that every empire is built on a foundation, and I was the only person who knew where the cracks were hiding. My name is Daniel Brooks. I turned 70 just a few weeks before everything fell apart. Most people looked at my life and saw perfection. I owned skyscrapers in several cities, vacation homes that overlooked oceans and mountains, classic cars that collectors begged me to sell, and enough wealth to ensure my family would never struggle again. From the outside, it looked like I had reached the finish line. Every magazine called me a self-made billionaire. Every business conference wanted me to tell my success story. Yet none of those people knew that the greatest mistake of my life was never a business decision. It was the woman I trusted with my heart. That Tuesday morning began like hundreds of others before it. The sun was just beginning to rise above the Pacific, painting the water with soft shades of gold. I sat alone in the breakfast room, holding a warm mug of black coffee while listening to the waves crashing against the cliffs below the house. The silence had always been my favorite part of the day because it reminded me of the years when life was simple. Before private jets, before board meetings, before every conversation revolved around contracts, investments, and numbers with too many zeros. Those quiet moments felt like the only place where I could still hear my own thoughts. I was reading the newspaper when I heard footsteps echo across the marble floor. I expected to see my 16-year-old son Ethan wandering into the kitchen with messy hair and headphones hanging around his neck. Music had become his escape during the last couple of years. He rarely cared about expensive things. Give him an old guitar, a notebook, and a quiet afternoon, and he was happier than most people sitting on billion-dollar yachts. I admired that about him because it reminded me of the young man I used to be before success complicated everything. Instead of Ethan, my wife Olivia walked into the room. She looked flawless, just as she always did whenever she was preparing to meet her friends at the country club. Every detail had been carefully planned. Perfect makeup, designer clothes, jewelry worth more than the average family home. Yet behind that polished appearance was a coldness I had been noticing for months. She smiled less. She stayed out later. Her phone never left her hand. Whenever I entered a room, conversations suddenly ended. Deep down, I already knew something had changed. But after 40 years of solving impossible business problems, I convinced myself I could somehow fix my marriage too. Without saying good morning, Olivia dropped a thick envelope onto the breakfast table. The heavy stack of papers slid across the polished wood until it stopped beside my coffee cup. Some of the coffee spilled onto the tablecloth, but she did not even glance at it. She simply crossed her arms and looked directly into my eyes with a calm expression that felt colder than anger. I slowly picked up the envelope and noticed the logo of one of the most aggressive divorce law firms in California. Before I even opened it, I already knew what was inside. Strange enough, I did not feel shocked. Sometimes your heart accepts the truth long before your mind is willing to admit. I looked back at Olivia and quietly asked if this was really what she wanted. She nodded. Without the slightest hesitation, this marriage ended a long time ago, Daniel. We have just been pretending because it was convenient. I want my freedom and I want my future before it is too late. There was no emotion in her voice, no sadness, no regret. She sounded like someone canceling a business contract instead of ending a marriage that had lasted more than a decade. I stared at the papers for several seconds before opening the first page. My attorney had once joked that experienced businessmen could estimate the cost of any deal within seconds. As I flipped through the pages, I realized this would be the most expensive deal of my entire life. She wanted our beachfront mansion. She wanted the penthouse in Manhattan. She wanted my collection of vintage cars, the investment portfolio, several vacation properties, and millions of dollars in cash. It was not simply a divorce settlement. It was an attempt to erase everything I had spent my life building. Most people expected a man in my position to explode with anger. They imagined I would throw the papers across the room or accuse her of betrayal. Instead, I quietly placed the documents back onto the table and asked one simple question. What about Ethan? For the first time that morning, Olivia looked slightly annoyed. She let out a long sigh, as though I had interrupted something far more important than discussing our own child. "He should stay with you," she answered. I frowned, convinced I had misunderstood. "Stay with me?" "Yes. He is old enough to make his own decisions. Besides, he has always been closer to you anyway." The room suddenly felt colder than the ocean outside. I leaned forward and studied her face, searching for any sign that she might be joking. There was nothing. Not even the smallest trace of guilt. I reminded her that Ethan was still a teenager, that he still needed both of his parents, that no amount of money could replace the feeling of knowing your mother wanted you. Olivia shrugged as though I had mentioned the weather. "Daniel, I am done sacrificing my happiness. I have spent years living around your schedule and your business. I finally have a chance to enjoy my life. I am not interested in raising another emotional teenager. He deserves stability. And frankly, you have enough money to provide that." Her words hit harder than any business failure I had ever experienced. She was not choosing freedom over marriage, she was choosing luxury over her own son. At that exact moment, I noticed movement near the hallway leading to the kitchen. Ethan stood completely still, holding one of his school books against his chest. His face had turned pale. He had heard every single word. He looked at his mother with eyes full of hope, silently waiting for her to laugh and admit this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Every child believes their parents love them without conditions. In that heartbreaking moment, I watched that belief disappear forever. Olivia glanced toward him for only a second before looking away again. Her silence became the cruelest answer she could have given. Ethan never said a word. He simply stood there staring at the woman who had tucked him into bed when he was little, celebrated his birthdays, and once promised she would always protect him. I watched his expression change by the second. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became heartbreak. Then something even worse settled across his face. Acceptance. No father should ever witness the moment his child realizes that one of the two people he trusts most in the world has decided he is no longer worth loving. That silent look hurt me far more than any insult Olivia had thrown at me. I pushed my chair back and walked toward my son, but before I could reach him, he turned around and disappeared down the hallway. His footsteps echoed through the house before the front door slammed shut, with enough force to shake the windows. For several seconds I remained frozen where I stood. Every instinct told me to chase after him, but another part of me wanted answers from the woman standing only a few feet away. I looked directly into Olivia's eyes and searched for even the smallest sign of regret. Instead, she reached for her phone as calmly as if nothing important had just happened. "You should probably go after him," she said without even looking up from her screen. "Teenagers are dramatic. He will calm down eventually." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. My own son had just watched his mother walk away from him emotionally, and her biggest concern seemed to be whatever notification had appeared on her phone. That was the moment something inside me changed forever. I had spent years making excuses for her selfish behavior. I blamed stress. I blamed our age difference. I blamed my endless work schedule. But standing there in that kitchen, I finally accepted the truth. The woman I married no longer existed, if she ever had. The person standing in front of me cared only about herself. Without another word, I hurried outside. The morning breeze carried the sound of waves crashing below the cliffs, but another sound caught my attention first: quiet sobbing. I followed it until I reached the wooden deck overlooking the beach. Ethan sat alone on the bottom step, with his elbows resting on his knees. His shoulders shook as he tried to hide his tears. Seeing him like that nearly brought me to my knees. I had watched billion-dollar projects collapse and survived financial crises that ruined other businessmen. Yet nothing compared to watching my son believe he was unwanted. I sat beside him without saying anything. Sometimes words only make pain louder. For several minutes, we simply stared at the ocean, while the silence carried more emotion than any conversation ever could. Finally, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie and spoke so quietly I almost missed it. Did I do something wrong? Those 5 words shattered whatever strength I still had. Children almost always blame themselves when adults fail them. They assume they were not smart enough, kind enough, or lovable enough. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. "No, son. You did absolutely nothing wrong. This is not your fault. Some people spend their whole lives chasing things that can never make them happy. Your mother made her choice, and one day she will have to live with it. He looked down at the sand below the deck and nodded slowly, but I could tell my words had not erased the wound. Pain like that does not disappear in a single conversation. It leaves scars that take years to heal. When we finally walked back into the house, Olivia was already speaking with someone on speakerphone. She was laughing. The same woman who had just broken her own son's heart was discussing spa appointments, shopping plans, and an upcoming weekend trip to New York. She noticed us enter the kitchen, covered the phone with one hand, and casually pointed toward the coffee stain that still covered the expensive tablecloth. Someone should clean that up before it dries. I stared at her for several seconds, not because I was angry anymore, but because I genuinely did not recognize the person standing in front of me. Everything about her suddenly felt artificial. The smile, the voice, even the perfume that once reminded me of happier years now smelled empty. I turned to Ethan. "Go pack a small bag. We are leaving for the day." He nodded without asking questions. A few moments later, we climbed into my old pickup truck, the one Olivia refused to ride in because she thought it looked embarrassing beside our luxury cars. As I drove along the Pacific Coast Highway, neither of us spoke very much. The ocean stretched endlessly beside us, while the radio remained silent. Every few miles I glanced toward my son. He stared out the passenger window, watching the waves roll onto the shore as if searching for answers that did not exist. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Dad, if Mom never wanted me, why did she pretend for so long?" I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. It was the hardest question I had ever been asked, because sometimes people fall in love with comfort instead of family. They become so focused on what they can gain that they forget who helped them get there. That says everything about them and nothing about you. He nodded slowly, but I knew those words would take years to truly understand. We spent the rest of the afternoon driving without any destination. We stopped at a small diner overlooking the water where nobody recognized us. We shared burgers and fries like we used to when he was little. For the first time all day, I saw a small smile return to his face. It was weak, but it reminded me that hope was still alive. That evening, after dropping Ethan off at my brother's house, where I knew he would be surrounded by people who genuinely loved him, I drove back to my home alone. The mansion looked exactly the same as it always had. The lights glowed through the giant windows, expensive artwork decorated the walls, and luxury cars filled the driveway. Yet somehow the place felt completely empty. I walked into my private office and closed the heavy oak door behind me. Every major business decision of my career had been made inside that room. On the wall hung photographs of projects that had taken decades to complete. People often assumed my success came from luck, but luck had never built anything lasting. Careful planning had. I opened the top drawer of my desk and removed a thick leather folder that had not been touched in years. Inside were documents almost everyone had forgotten existed. They were created long before I met Olivia, back when I believed every successful businessman needed protection against unpredictable circumstances. Looking through those papers, an old memory returned to me, and for the first time since that terrible morning, I smiled, a quiet smile, not because I was happy, because I finally realized something Olivia had completely overlooked. She believed she understood the value of everything I owned. She had counted every house, every investment, every luxury car, every dollar, but she had never bothered to ask the one question that separates smart people from greedy people. What if the most valuable asset was never listed on the surface? I reached for my phone and called the only person I trusted to handle what came next. She answered before the second ring. "Daniel, I was expecting your call." I took one last look at the folder resting on my desk before speaking. "Prepare every document. Tomorrow, we begin." The woman who answered my call had been my attorney for nearly 20 years. Her name was Rebecca Carter, and she had built a reputation that made powerful people nervous. She was brilliant, relentless, and impossible to intimidate. During my career, I had watched her dismantle billion-dollar lawsuits with the same calm confidence that most people use to order coffee. If there was anyone I trusted with the next chapter of my life, it was her. "Daniel, I already heard rumors," Rebecca said quietly. Several firms have been talking about your divorce all morning. Tell me one thing before we discuss strategy. Are you angry enough to fight, or are you simply trying to survive? I looked through the office window toward the ocean that had once brought me peace. The answer came without hesitation. Neither. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then what are you planning? I took a slow breath before answering. I am protecting my son. Rebecca did not interrupt. She knew me well enough to understand there was more behind those words. I explained everything from the beginning. I told her how Olivia had demanded nearly every major asset I owned. I described the expression on Ethan's face when he realized his own mother wanted the mansion, but not him. As I spoke, my voice remained calm, but inside I felt every moment all over again. By the time I finished, the line had gone completely silent. Finally, Rebecca spoke. Daniel, I have represented some terrible people over the years, but I have never heard anything like that. Neither had I. She immediately began outlining several legal strategies. We could challenge the settlement. We could investigate Olivia's finances. We could subpoena phone records. If she had been hiding money or having an affair, the courts would look at the divorce very differently. Most people in my position would have accepted that offer without hesitation. I surprised her with a single sentence. I do not want a long court battle. Rebecca sounded genuinely confused. You are willing to let her walk away with everything? No. I am willing to let her believe she has. Another silence filled the room. Rebecca knew that tone in my voice. She had heard it before during business negotiations, where competitors believed they had trapped me, only to discover months later that they had stepped directly into a deal designed years in advance. Daniel, what are you not telling me? I stood and walked toward the old wooden bookshelf that covered the far wall of my office. Hidden behind several framed photographs was a small electronic safe that had not been opened in years. My fingerprint unlocked it instantly. Inside were dozens of legal folders. Some contained contracts, some contained land surveys. One contained the documents I had been searching for. I carefully removed the folder and placed it on my desk. Do you remember the Horizon Trust? Rebecca answered almost immediately. The trust you established more than 20 years ago before your company went public? Exactly. Her breathing slowed. Daniel, that trust still exists. It never stopped existing. I opened the folder and smiled for the first time that entire day. Most people believed I personally owned every major property connected to my business empire. That assumption had always been wrong. Years before I became famous, one mentor had given me advice that completely changed the way I protected my wealth. Never allow emotion to control ownership. Separate the buildings from the ground beneath them. At the time, I thought he was overly cautious. Years later, I realized he had probably saved my future. Rebecca suddenly understood where my thoughts were leading. Wait. Daniel, are you telling me? I finished her sentence. Olivia only asked for the houses. She never asked who owned the land. Rebecca laughed once. Not because anything was funny, because she had just realized how enormous Olivia's mistake might become. For years, the public believed my beachfront mansion belonged entirely to me. Technically, the structure did. The land beneath it belonged to an independent trust created decades earlier. Exactly the same arrangement existed for several other high-value properties. Everything had been perfectly legal. Everything had been documented. Almost nobody remembered those details anymore. Rebecca slowly flipped through copies of the trust, agreements, while I listened to the pages turning through the speakerphone. Finally, she whispered, "She has absolutely no idea. No, she doesn't." Rebecca leaned into professional mode almost instantly. Daniel, if these agreements are still enforceable, she could become responsible for maintenance, taxes, insurance, and lease obligations the moment ownership transfers. Exactly. She would spend every waking hour celebrating the mansion while never realizing the foundation beneath it belonged to someone else. Greed has one weakness. It only looks at what shines. It never studies what supports it. Rebecca closed the file. I finally understand. You are not surrendering, you are baiting her. I smiled. For 40 years I built skyscrapers. You cannot build anything that lasts unless the foundation is stronger than the walls. Olivia spent 10 years admiring expensive views. She never once asked what was holding them up. Rebecca laughed again, this time with genuine admiration. You planned this decades before you even met her. No, I planned it decades before I knew I would ever need it. That is the difference. Insurance always looks unnecessary until the day disaster arrives. Rebecca's tone became serious once more. There is still one problem. What is it? She may refuse to sign. If she thinks something is hidden inside the agreement, she will slow everything down. I looked at the divorce papers spread across my desk. No, she will sign. She has already made one decision that tells me exactly how she thinks. Rebecca waited. A person willing to abandon their own child for money will never stop reading because of caution. They stop reading because they believe they have already won. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Rebecca said the words that changed everything. Then let us make sure she feels like the biggest winner in America. I nodded. Prepare every document exactly as she requested. The mansion, the penthouse, the investment portfolio, the classic cars, everything. Rebecca hesitated. Everything? Everything, but add one document she will never expect. She must permanently surrender every parental right connected to Ethan. No future custody claims, no inheritance claims, no legal authority. Nothing. Rebecca slowly exhaled. You are making her choose. No, I corrected her quietly. She already made her choice this morning. I am simply putting her decision into legal writing. Rebecca closed the folder. By tomorrow afternoon, she will believe she owns your entire world. I looked toward the family photograph sitting on my desk. Ethan was smiling in that picture. He still believed families lasted forever when it was taken. I gently turned the frame toward me. No, tomorrow afternoon, she will believe she defeated an old man. By tomorrow night, she will discover she declared war against a father. The following afternoon, Rebecca and I walked into one of the most prestigious law offices in Los Angeles. The conference room overlooked the entire city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the afternoon sun. Years ago, I would have admired the architecture. That day, I barely noticed it. My attention was fixed on one thing only. I wanted to see whether Olivia's greed had grown exactly the way I expected it would. She was already seated when we arrived. She looked happier than I had seen her in years. Her designer handbag rested on the polished conference table beside an expensive pair of sunglasses. She smiled the moment I entered, but it was not the smile of someone ending a painful marriage. It was the smile of someone convinced they had just won the lottery. Her attorney, Michael Hayes, stood to shake my hand. Daniel, I appreciate you taking the reasonable approach. Divorce cases usually become ugly. It appears we can avoid all that today. I returned the handshake politely. That depends on how quickly everyone signs. Rebecca placed several folders on the table, while Michael reviewed the documents one page at a time. Every few moments he nodded with visible satisfaction. The beachfront mansion. Transferred. The Manhattan penthouse. Transferred. The investment accounts. Transferred luxury vehicles. Transferred artwork. Transferred. Every page seemed to convince him even more that I had completely surrendered. Finally, he looked up. I have to admit, Daniel, I expected a fight. Most people would never agree to terms this generous. I simply smiled. Sometimes peace costs less than war. Olivia could barely hide her excitement. She leaned across the table and began flipping through the papers herself. Her eyes moved quickly over each page, stopping only whenever she found another expensive asset now carrying her name. She never asked a single question. She never slowed down, exactly as I expected. After several minutes, Michael closed the folder. Everything appears to be in order. Rebecca quietly slid one additional document toward Olivia. There is only one final agreement that must accompany the settlement. Olivia frowned. What is this? I answered before anyone else could speak. It permanently ends every legal responsibility and every legal right connected to Ethan. The room became silent. Olivia picked up the document. She read the title. Then she looked at me. You actually want this? I nodded. Yesterday you made your position very clear. You said you wanted freedom. I am giving it to you. This agreement means there will never be custody hearings, no future legal disputes, no financial claims connected to Ethan, no inheritance disputes, no surprise visits years from now when it becomes convenient. Your life goes one direction. His life goes another. Forever. Michael adjusted his glasses. It is unusual, but legally acceptable if both parties agree voluntarily. Olivia looked down at the document again. For a brief second, I wondered whether some tiny part of her heart might still exist. Maybe she would hesitate. Maybe she would remember the little boy who once waited by the front door every evening, just to hug her after work. Maybe she would remember teaching him to ride a bicycle. Maybe she would remember reading bedtime stories. Instead, she shrugged. Honestly, it probably makes everything easier. Rebecca stared at her in complete disbelief. Olivia reached for the pen. Daniel, you always said business works best when emotions stay out of the room. Looks like I finally learned something from you. Then, without another thought, she signed one signature, less than 3 seconds. That was all it took for a mother to erase herself from her own son's future. She slid the document back across the table. There, are we finished? I picked up the agreement carefully. Every signature was complete. Every page was legally binding. I folded the document and placed it inside my briefcase as though it were the most valuable paper I had ever owned. Because it was. Rebecca handed Michael the certified settlement documents. Michael smiled broadly. Congratulations. Everything is officially settled. Olivia stood first. She looked almost radiant. She was already talking about redesigning the Malibu house, replacing the furniture, hosting parties, and spending several weeks in Europe before the end of summer. She wasn't leaving a marriage. She was planning a celebration. Before walking away, she stopped beside my chair. I hope there are no hard feelings. Sometimes people simply outgrow each other. I looked up at her calmly. No, sometimes they simply reveal who they really are. She laughed softly. Maybe. Either way, I won. Then she walked out of the conference room without looking back. The door closed behind her. Silence filled the room. Rebecca slowly turned toward me. I have practiced law for 28 years. I have never seen anyone sign away that much without reading every page. I closed my briefcase. Greed makes people read numbers. Wisdom makes people read contracts. She only saw the numbers. Michael gathered his own papers, still convinced his client had achieved the greatest legal victory of his career. As he reached the doorway, he smiled. Your ex-wife is leaving here as a very wealthy woman. I nodded. For today. He looked confused. Today, I stood and buttoned my jacket. Tell me something, Michael. When you buy a beautiful mansion, what is the first thing you inspect? He answered immediately. The structure, of course. I smiled. That is where your client made her mistake. She admired the house. She never asked who owned the ground beneath it. His confident expression disappeared. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Rebecca remained completely silent. Michael slowly opened one of the property files again. His eyes scanned the legal descriptions. Then he stopped. His face lost every trace of color. No, he whispered. That cannot be right. It is. The primary structures were transferred exactly as requested. The underlying ground lease was never part of the marital estate. His breathing became noticeably heavier. He flipped through another document, then another. His hands actually began shaking. Daniel, these leases, I finished his sentence, expire tomorrow. At midnight. The room felt completely different now. Only moments earlier they believed I had walked away defeated. Now they understood something far more terrifying. Olivia had not taken my empire. She had accepted responsibility for properties whose foundations she never truly owned. Rebecca finally stood. She looked directly at Michael. You may want to call your client immediately. He grabbed his phone with trembling hands and rushed out of the conference room. The moment the door closed behind him, Rebecca looked at me with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. She smiled. You never lost today. I looked toward the city skyline beyond the glass windows. No, the only thing I lost was the illusion that money creates a family. But I gained something much more valuable. My son would never again question whether someone truly wanted him. And for the first time in many years, that was worth more than every mansion, every luxury car, and every dollar I had ever earned.